I think so.
It sort of is stuck in the corner.
Thank you. Before I begin, I'd like to thank the organizing committee for the invitation to be here. Very much enjoyed the chance to be at the conference. I think it's been a tremendous success. And I'd like to thank the members of the audience for being here. This is, I guess, kind of early for this conference, but I need to extend a quick thanks to a couple people whose work is contained in my presentation. Laura Kowalczyk, who's here, Jae-Hong Kim, who could not be here, a professor at school, and Alexander Puzrin, who's at ETH Zurich, but a collaborator on some of the research I'll be talking about. So originally I was going to talk on a much broader subject matter, but in preparing the presentation I thought it might be good to refine it to a slightly smaller area of engineering research and I think opportunities to make a real impact on global health, and that is within the area of water and or sanitation, recognizing that the two are closely linked as they relate to health concerns. What I'd like to do is begin quickly to overview some of the existing technology in very simple terms, not getting into details of the technology, that we use in the developing world for the treatment of water for the purposes of safe, potable drinking water. And I'd like to identify the challenges that we have from the engineering community and beyond, but with a kind of a focus on the engineering community, on extrapolating or translating those technologies into the developing world where the health concerns are obviously the greatest. I'd then like to move on to some areas of materials applications where we're seeing the intersection between material science engineering and civil engineering for treatment of water for improved health. So I'll be focusing not on access to water, but on ways to make water safe to drink using new materials that are, I think, quite exciting. And then I'd like to end with a discussion that is a key concern for me, and I think should be a key concern for all the disciplines that are represented in the room. There's the potential for people to develop all sorts of neat gadgets or widgets that are going to change the health concerns in the developing world, but that I think many of those will end up being left on the shelf if we don't develop transdisciplinary approaches to evaluate, test, and try to develop business markets. And so with that, I would like to just begin with a discussion of why a focus on water for this presentation. I think with this audience, it's probably not worth dwelling on. Most people know the statistics. But clearly, because of pathogens in water and other contaminants in water, we have significant health concerns globally. Obviously, a very strong focus on the health of children. But as Jenna Davis spoke yesterday, we're having real troubles in trying to reach water supply. And Jenna also commented on the fact that supply does not necessarily translate to improved health, which is what I'd like to talk about today. And I would also like to say that some of the challenges we have in water were also discussed yesterday in the same room with population growth and the idea that we're going to have many more people to provide water to in the coming decades, but with water supply staying the same or being a little bit worse because of global climate change. So we have a strong reason to be focused on improving access to water, in particular access to water that's safe to drink. If we look at how we do this in the developed world, it's relatively straightforward. Well, I shouldn't say that. It's a complex system in some ways, but it's in place for some time, and therefore it seems straightforward. But it's important to note that it's enormous in scale. Most people, when they start thinking about potable water, they don't think about the dam that provides the reservoir that provides the water supply, for example, and working downstream all the way to the infrastructure that actually brings it to the tap in your home, collects it, treats it, and returns it to the environment. It's an enormous infrastructure, and it is something that is lacking in the developing world, of course. In the developed world, whether it's the United States, Europe, Japan, elsewhere, you see strong governmental involvement in the infrastructure. Lots of financing comes centrally. An example of that locally for me, just to give a sense of how heavily financed we are, I live in a city of about 500,000 people. We'll spend $2 billion in the next 2 years to repair our sewer system. That's not to put in a new sewer system, that's just to repair it. And so when you look about heavily financing, you're usually working in the billions, tens, or hundreds of billions of dollars. Interestingly, in the United States and most of the developed world, most of the consumers have no idea how they got their water to begin with, what was upstream of it. And really the educational component of water treatment in the United States is largely refined to only a few disciplines, and most people have no idea. It's a real difference between some of the activities in the developing world where we're relying on education to really make some big improvements, and so there's a real disconnect at this level between the developed and underdeveloped parts of the world. When we look specifically in the United States and we think about the infrastructure that provides us our water and sanitation, the two cannot really be disconnected. It's a long list of things that we work with, many of which fall into the engineering sector, but not exclusively. Water supply, building of reservoirs, fields for extraction of groundwater, etc. Resource protection, we have a number of laws that provide us a relatively clean water source to begin with, i.e. sanitation. What I call heavy infrastructure, these are the pumps, pipes, dams, water towers, conveyance systems, etc. that are required for what we do. We try to minimize energy use, but as it turns out, it's still the number one operational cost. And so all of our systems are heavily energy reliant, which of course in the developing world is a struggle. Chemicals, things like chlorine, but not exclusively, that require logistics and supply chains to provide them. Subsidies I already mentioned. Regulatory framework, we treat water to levels based on law, which is not often put times in place in the developing world where the health issues are the greatest concern. Capital, property ownerships, and social acceptance are just some of the ones. As it turns out, if you remove any one of those, our system falls apart. And in most places where we're trying to put in improved water systems, many of these would be missing. And what it is a disconnect between our approaches for water treatment and what needs to be done in the developing world. I tell students it's not hard to create clean, safe water. We teach it, it's in textbooks, it's really not that difficult of a subject matter. But it's impossible without all of these things based on the systems that we use. So what we've been working on at Tech and other research universities around the country are the development of some new technologies or new approaches that we think could be translated into the developing world. We hope. I want to come back to that later. But our challenge, at least in terms of science and engineering research as it relates to safe water in the developing world, is to move away from our thought processes of the mature technologies that will be very, very difficult to implement, at least in any short time period, to recognize that currently there is no silver bullet that's going to solve the problems in the developing world, and that we probably are going to need a range of technologies depending on location. I said they're still not yet these technologies. I'm hoping that some of them will emerge soon, and I'll give you some examples of what we're trying to do. One of the things that's been most exciting in science and engineering research over the last decade is advances have been made in materials, and I want to illustrate that in our presentation today. There's things we can do today with the materials we can make today that could never have been done 10 years ago. We've really made huge leaps. And what we're trying to do is translate these advances into opportunities for applications in the developing world. And so this is going to sound like a bit of a high-tech approach, but what we're trying to do is try to take what are established low-tech approaches and make them better. And one of the ideas I wanted to focus on is the ability to disinfect water using light as your disinfection source. And many people in the room have heard of the SOSIS approach, which is to take relatively clean water, low turbidity, and expose it to UV light, the UV light coming from the sun. Unfortunately, the atmosphere is a very good filter for UV light, and the amount of UV that comes through the atmosphere and reaches these bottles is pretty small. It's a good thing for us because UV light is a strong, it breaks down DNA, and we wouldn't want to be exposed to that. But we're trying to kill bacteria by exposing them to UV light and by breaking down their DNA. That's the basic way this works. The UV light destroys nucleic acids. What we would like to do is actually create the disinfectant in the bottle using light energy, and not rely on the UV source of the sun, but take advantage of visible light, which is abundant. Visible light, however, does not affect DNA. What we need to affect DNA is UV light. And what we have been working on is the application of new materials, in this case, a molecule that's known as Buckminster fullerene. Buckminster fullerene was discovered in 1993. It was awarded the Nobel Prize to Richard Smalley for its discovery in 1995. And has become an extremely useful molecule for a range of applications, and we're trying to use it for water treatment. As it turns out, Buckminster fullerene likes to absorb visible light. When it absorbs visible light, it gets excited. And when it gets excited, it needs to dissipate that energy someplace, and where it likes to dissipate the energy is onto oxygen. So the dissolved oxygen that's in the molecule receives energy from UV light. We create singlet oxygen, hit the wrong button. This is a strong disinfecting agent. So the idea is, if you tether these small molecules inside one of those Sosis bottles, you could put it in the sun, and the visible light would produce a disinfectant, a strong disinfectant agent that is very effective at killing organisms. This is an example of viral kill in exposure to Atlanta sunlight on a relatively warm summer day. That doesn't make a big difference how hot it is. But you see that we're getting about 99% removal in about 30 minutes of a very difficult to break down virus in the water. So the idea that you could use the same approach as a Sosis bottle but get good kill in about 50 minutes or less is extremely exciting. And by the way, it's getting cheaper, a lot cheaper than you might think. Another example is really an amazing breakthrough in science recently that involves the ability to create UV light from visible light. Now, for those of you who haven't thought about the light spectrum in a while, visible light is lower energy than UV light. And so how do you take something that's low energy and produce high energy? Well, what we've done is we've created materials that can absorb multiple photons of visible light and store that energy, like in a bank account. And then when they relax, they dissipate and combine that energy and produce UV light. So inside of a bottle, we can expose to visible light and actually release UV, store the energy from visible light and release it as UV right inside the bottle. The example, I don't think you can see it in the back, but we show in the dark the growth of, whoops, wrong way. I've got to learn how to use this. The growth of biofilms on a bottle surface, which this is a scanning electron micrograph of bacterial cells. And shortly after exposure, within about 30 minutes, we see clean surfaces. So another example of a materials application is very, very modern. It's very, very inexpensive. Whether it's inexpensive enough, I can't answer that for you today. But the market for this could be huge. The question is whether or not it would actually be the type of disinfecting strategy that we want.